Good afternoon. We're going to get started right away. Welcome to panel 2 of the Rita Hauser Symposium, The Lost Promise of the Post-Cold War Era. We're privileged to have 3 distinguished speakers here to address this period. First, we have Nguyen from Columbia University, Steve Walt of Harvard Kennedy School, and Charlie Kupchan on screen, who's our senior fellow, as well as a professor at Georgetown University. I'm going to take a bit of an issue with the title as The Lost Promise, because I think what we want to do in this session is really tease out some of the nuance in the different periods of this 30 years since the end of the Cold War. So what I'd like to do is start by asking the panelists to discuss the immediate post-Cold War period, namely the Bush, George H.W. Bush, and Clinton administrations, to just try to tease out some of the things that they were presented with, what they did, what worked, and what didn't. And I'd like to start, partly because I know the last panel did not get to the Vietnam War, to start and ask Nguyen to talk about both the legacy of the Vietnam War and how you think that affected the disposition to use force or not in those 2 administrations. But also very critically, at the end of the Cold War, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc, how did that reposition US-China relations? Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'll just say, I feel like I'm mismatched for this panel. I should have been with my colleagues in the last panel, but I'm very honored to be here, in particular with Professor Walt and Professor Kupchan, because I've been longtime fans of them as a historian. So even within my in my field, in my discipline of history, I'm known a little bit as an archive rat. So I know the Vietnamese language documentation quite well, and was one of the first to get in the Nixon library, but I feel like I'm one of those splitters. I'm not a lumper, as my advisors at Yale wanted us all to be in the international history program. They wanted us to be lumpers and to take big questions, but I was fixated on the Vietnam War, the history of the war, and in particular, how North Vietnam defeated the United States. And so I spent a lot of time in the archives, but as a result, have somewhat of tunnel vision. So I enjoy having these sorts of discussions. And what they told me at the council was that it was just great timing because I just became a member. And when I first became a member, they're like, great, we're going to put you on with our leading political scientists, those who really influence educated public opinion, Professor Walt, Professor Kupchan. I'm like, great, okay, you're throwing me in the deep end. So with that, I mean, one of the things that I teach both when I was at the University of Kentucky and then now at Columbia was a 2-semester history of U.S. foreign relations. And I always ended in 1991. And so that is because I'm a global Cold War historian. But my final lecture is always setting the stage in terms of the end of the Cold War and what that meant for the United States and foreign policy and domestic public opinion. And one of the things that struck me about 1991 was that it was very similar in certain ways to 1945. And when I talk about that, it was basically that with the end of the Cold War, so much of what we would say of the sort of Cold War imposed order, it just disappeared. And so in many ways, what US presidents, starting with George H.W. Bush, had to deal with was, with that gone, what took place, what basically came about. And that were 2 processes, fragmentation and integration. And so one of the things that I always say to my students is that, can you imagine that, the Cold War that they were living under, this East-West ideological rivalry gave way, and what you had was transformational change. And so with the sort of, again, these 2 processes of fragmentation and integration, you also had an explosion of conflicts. And by 1993, there was no less than 48, I think New York Times counted 48 conflicts. And this was, again, very similar in many ways to the wars for decolonization that took place almost immediately at the end of 1945, at the end of World War II. But in another similar way, if you also look at the United States and where it was positioned by 1991, it was basically the US economy was 40% larger than that of the second-ranked nation. Its defense spending was 6 times of the next 6 countries in terms of their defense spending. And this, I ran across a quote from you in terms of the promotion of soft power. The United States had an enormous influence, and it didn't know what to do with it and didn't put much effort into expanding it. Do you remember that quote?
Okay, Professor Sadly, Walt. No.
So this was the unipolar moment. But at the same time, again, as a historian of the Vietnam War, one of the aspects that I teach my students is about the impact of that war on US foreign policy. And while we now know that the rise of the right, the populist right, began with what many have called the silent majority, pretty much under Nixon's administration, that they were just below the surface during the Vietnam War and came into basically full emergence under the Reagan administration. So one of the things I say is, while there was the death of the imperial presidency with Watergate, what you also have is another current that's underlying in US foreign policy, which is the rise of this populist right. And so what happened under Reagan, while there was basically distaste for foreign interventions, military interventions on the part of Ford and Carter moving forward, under Reagan, you had what was rollback. And so you had what was, in many ways, basically the second Cold War. So we cannot ignore that in terms of laying the foundation for then what would happen in 1991. So basically, at this point, if you're George H.W. Bush, we're victorious. We won the Cold War against the Soviet Union. This is a dissolution of the Soviet Empire, including the communism in Eastern Europe. But at the same time, you have an American public that's just tired of overseas intervention. And you have a victorious, basically, populations like, we don't need to do this anymore. So unlike the loss of 1975 and the fall of Saigon, what you have is a public that is, we won, there's no need for any more foreign entanglements. And so that's the kind of context I hope that we remember as a historian.
Thank you. I want to go next to Charlie, and thank you for laying many of the threads, I think, for this conversation. And Charlie, certainly I'd like you to give us sort of a short take on how you evaluate the use of the peace dividend by these two administrations. But I'd like, if you will, to specifically touch on a couple of points. You've been critical of NATO enlargement as creating concerns for Russia. And also in terms of the use of force, it's quite interesting that, as you have written and others, that Clinton strove mightily to avoid entanglement in the Balkans, hoping that European diplomacy would do up, of course, wound up with the Kosovo air campaign. And I think also I would argue that Bush, those two main interventions, the largest since the Vietnam War, the Panama intervention and Desert Storm, were, compared to what would come later, at least, finite and relatively successful. So Charlie, over to you for your take on this moment of the early years, the post-Cold War.
Thanks, Linda. Good to be with everybody, and greetings to Rita, whom I haven't seen for a long time.
Charlie, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Linda. Great to be with everybody, and greetings to Rita Hauser, whom I haven't seen for a long time, but hello, and thanks for bringing us all together today. I do think that, having served in the Clinton administration first term, I definitely felt what Hung was talking about in terms of the reluctance to get involved, the kind of legacy, the post-Vietnam legacy, which also had elements that were left over from the bombings in the Middle East, and just general sense that we're not going to get involved in these weird ethno-national conflicts anymore. We're not going to do mountains. We fight big armored division warfare. And I think that partly explains why President Clinton, who came into office wanting to get involved in the Balkans, didn't really do so until 1995. But I think that the story that I want to tell that's more relevant for the panel is in some ways the opposite, because I do think that it was during the 1990s that the United States began to engage in a combination of what I would call strategic overreach and liberal overreach. And by liberal, I mean neoliberal market orthodoxy, that to some extent explains where we are today and the sort of populist backlash against the establishment. And I think that there really was an ideological self-confidence, maybe hubris would be the right word, that took hold in Washington after the end of the Cold War. Our system worked, and as a consequence, the goal is to universalize that system. And I think the United States embarked on a process of expanding NATO, expanding the EU, bringing Russia into the G7, bringing China into the WTO, that in some ways caused more harm than good. And that was sort of the era of what I would call the liberal interventionists. The neocons took over after 9/11, but I don't think in the end there was that much difference between liberal interventionists and neocons when it came to this idea of forcibly expanding and propagating Pax Americana. And I do think that that is what got us into what we now call the forever wars. Americans, I think, soured on the internationalist cause because those wars in the Middle East did not go very well. And in many ways, Trump's America First,
We'll get to that.
his promise to kind of pull back from these wars was one of his calling cards in the election, although obviously, given the war in Iran, he seems to have backtracked on that. And then there was also during the 1990s, and in particular after the 1994 election, I think a pivot toward deregulation, financialization, let the market rule, open up U.S. economy to free trade, that in some ways exacerbated the socioeconomic dislocations that were already occurring because of automation. And in my mind, if I were to sort of say, tell me where Donald Trump came from, I would put my finger on the hollowing out of the middle class that was the product of this fierce combination of automation, globalization, and the loss of particularly Americans without a college education of their well-paid jobs.
Thank you.
On the
Carolee, I'm
manufacturing
going to
line.
get to globalization in the next segment. Thank you so much. Stephen, I would like to ask you to comment on this early period and what you see as, if you agree, planting the seeds for the later overreach, but also what you see as perhaps some missed opportunities or things that did produce infrastructure useful for the future.
Sure. So I want to go back and actually put in a good word, at least 2 cheers for the George H.W. Bush administration. The sort of, I would characterize as the last realist administration we've actually had. Remember that they are dealing with a remarkable period of change, things happening that are really quite dramatic. They're having to rethink a lot of what the United States is doing. This is the phrase that I first remember hearing there, the New World Order, was the way they talked about it. But look at what they did. In response to the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, they go to the United Nations, they get a Security Council resolution, and they're able to forge a very large coalition to wage that war. They also have the good sense not to go to Baghdad to wage war with limited aims, explicitly because that was not authorized by the UN Security Council resolution. And in fact, the Bush administration understood that if you were trying to establish a rules-based order, you had to follow those rules, at least most of the time. They also managed the end of the Cold War remarkably well. You can think of lots of ways in which the breakup of the Soviet Empire and ultimately the breakup of the Soviet Union could have gone south much quicker and in much nastier ways, and they managed that quite well. And in the aftermath of the successful Desert Storm, they managed the Madrid Conference. They put together a constructive multilateral engagement to try and start moving the entire region towards a more peaceful order. So you look at all of that, that actually looks remarkably good, not perfect. You could find things to criticize throughout. Every administration makes mistakes. But I think the record of Bush 41 in foreign policy is a textbook case of the sort of judicious use of American power, leaving us in a remarkably favorable position. But, and there is always a but, if you read the president's and Brent Scowcroft's joint memoir, A World Transformed, there's a passage in there where they talk about finding themselves at the pinnacle of power with the rarest opportunity to remake the world for the benefit of the United States and all mankind. And to me, it's that sentiment that is the segue into what Charlie talked about, the hubris that then becomes the Clinton administration, where suddenly the United States believes we actually have the magic formula that we can spread around the world, and moreover, that the rest of the world is eager for it, ready to embrace it. They want to become like the United States. People love to point to Frank Fukuyama. I always like to point to Tom Friedman's book, Lexus and the Olive Tree, where he talks about Dos Capitalism 6.0. It's sort of invented in America. If you're going to survive in a globalized world, you basically have to become like the United States of America. And I believe that's the attitude that pervades the 1990s and lasts well into the aughts, well into even the Obama administration. For a previous book, I once went and looked at a series of task force reports done by various think tanks, bipartisan commissions over a 25-year period. And what's remarkable about these task force reports is they all basically say the same thing, that the United States' mission is to keep spreading these liberal values around the world. And they do that in the 90s. They say it again in 2007, 2008, after the financial crisis. They do it again later after the Arab Spring. No matter what the condition of the world is, in short, the United States is going to go out and fix it. And there was remarkably little learning in that whole process, that some of the things we were doing actually weren't working particularly well. And that's, it seems to me, exactly as Charlie pointed out, what ultimately opened the door to a anti-elite, populist, anti-expert, we think we know how to do better, let's disengage from the world approach that we are now seeing in spades. Just because things were bad in this disappointing unipolar moment doesn't mean we can't make them worse.
Thank you. Well, we've previewed some of the thoughts about what happened with 9/11 and the subsequent involvement in what turned out to be very long-running wars, the longest wars in our history. And I think that it's important here. I'd just like to ask for some perhaps brief reflections. This was not foreseen, right? And you know, Donald Rumsfeld, the idea was go in, get rid of the Taliban, get out. In the case of Iraq, which I spent a lot of time in both countries, there was an idea you would bring in some of the expats, Ahmed Chalabi, some other people out in a tent in the desert after I finished covering the major combat phase. And I thought, this is really not going to work very well. They hadn't been in the country for years. So we got step by step drawn in to trying to remake the countries as these insurgencies really prevented the possibility of an exit with anything like a mission accomplished, as the original infamous banner said. So I just wonder if there's some additional reflections about the difficulty of getting out, and maybe for Charlie, let me start with you on this, because I think you wrote very well about your experience in the Obama administration mightily trying to avoid that latter period, trying to get out of Afghanistan. He was talked into the surge there, had to go back into Iraq when the ISIS Islamic State caliphate came about, were talked into Libya. I just wonder if you could reflect on the most sort of adamant, don't do stupid stuff president winds up really getting sunk into a lot of these conflicts.
Yeah, Linda, I mean, I think it's, in some ways, I think that Barack Obama wanted to break the mold that we've been talking about. And I did sit in on lots of meetings where he questioned the narrative, where he questioned whether this idea that everybody around the world wanted to sip from the cup of American values in the American-led order. And he struggled mightily with that issue when he was generally surrounded by people who were sipping from that cup and who came out of that era that we were talking about earlier, the 90s, the 2000s. And so I do think in some ways Obama ended up in a situation where he did things that probably his gut was telling him he shouldn't have done, including getting into Libya. I think Syria he struggled with hugely, with a lot of pressure from some of the people in the room to get more deeply involved. But he was looking at what happened in Libya, Afghanistan, and Iraq and saying, I don't really want to go there. And, in some ways, I think that Steve is right, that the one party that comes out of this story looking pretty good is George H.W. Bush, simply because they seem to have had a certain pragmatic realist approach, and they kept the ideology in check, and they didn't bring down the regime. They used military force to achieve military ends, and I think they kept in check the mission that George W. then wanted to complete, which was getting rid of the Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi regime. But I do think in the end of the day, Obama wanted to get out of the Middle East, and the Middle East wouldn't let go. And that's exactly what Donald Trump is finding out.
Stephen, let me follow up with you and ask you, because sort of who's the difficulties of retrenchment, of getting out of trying to limit your objectives. I know you have articulated the critique of the blob, but I would also add the foreign policy blob, the foreign policy wonks that have maybe contributed to aspirational foreign policy, but also I think if you give the military a mission, they're always going to try to come up with a new plan to achieve success. So really the buck does stop with the presidents. But how do you look at the difficulties of actually implementing a restrained policy?
Very, very good. So the biggest problem with the forever wars is we had forgotten how difficult it is to create a liberal democracy that actually works. This was a process that took hundreds of years in the West, was a very contentious process. This is a process that was actually difficult here in the United States to create what we think of as 20th century American democracy. We fought a civil war. And by the way, we forgot about our experience with Reconstruction, which was in fact a military occupation, which didn't ultimately achieve its aims. And that was in a country that we knew pretty well, our own. All right. So the idea that you could bring in government in a box and do this in a place like Afghanistan, which couldn't be more unfamiliar to Americans, was, I think, really quite remarkable. The second problem, and this gets at the why couldn't you get out, and I'd be fascinated to hear what you have to say about this, is an echo of what Daniel Ellsberg called the stalemate machine. That in Vietnam, presidents understood it wasn't going well, but the idea was not to be the president that loses and pass it on to your successor. All right? And this is what happens in Afghanistan and Iraq as well. People have collected the list of number of times that political or military leaders told us that they had finally turned the corner, a quotation that recurs over and over and over from 2006 on. The corner was never turned, right? And each president ultimately found it easier to order a surge, to say they were going to do something slightly different, and then eventually hand it off to their successor. Even Donald Trump, in the first year of his first term, actually did a little mini surge in Afghanistan as well. So this was a recurring problem. I think, Linda, you're exactly right, that once you give the U.S. military a job, they do not want to tell you that they can't do it. That's understandable. You sort of want that can-do attitude in your military. But you combine those things, it made it extremely difficult. And finally, last but not least, who was the one American politician who was skeptical about the mission in Afghanistan from 2009 on? Joe Biden. He was right. And when he became president, he took the very difficult step of withdrawing. It was chaotic. It was always going to be chaotic because it was a house of cards we were propping up. And as soon as it was clear that the United States was leaving, the house of cards was going to collapse. He took enormous political heat for that in his first year as president, even though it was, in fact, the right decision. And the fact that he took that heat is evidence of why all of his predecessors had said, no, I'm not going to try and get out. I'll just kick it down the road.
Thank you. Thank you. I would like to ask Hang to actually address the other big piece of this period, this story, which was the repeated declarations of a needed pivot to Asia, which did not happen, partly because of this.
Yes, I'll definitely answer that, and the issue of China pretty much after 1991, the end of the Cold War. But I want to again repeat something that I always say to my students: is that the United States rarely gets to dictate the origins, the evolution, and the end of any overseas intervention. So once again, this loss of promise of the unipolar moment, I would say it wasn't for the United States to be able to dominate and dictate and control through even to the end of the century to the next. And I think that's one of the lessons that I wish my students would take away, is that the answers don't just come from Washington, D.C., that you have to look at our allies and how they read our actions. You definitely have to understand and look at our enemies and see how they are interpreting what we do. And then at the same time, realize that the United States can't control all. There's agency with the rest of that belongs to the rest of the world. And the United States forgot that with Vietnam. It forgot it through, I would say, with the Reagan doctrine, and then in this lost promise of the unipolar moment. Because that's not how it works. I mean, I think that is something that, again, the 20th century Cold War taught us. In terms of the sort of this lost opportunity with the pivot to Asia, I would say one would have to look at the People's Republic of China and what was going on there, if there was any lost momentum with this non-pivot to Asia. That it is something that if you align it with what was going on, whether it is under Deng Xiaoping to a certain point, which is hide and bide, then to Hu Jintao and then Xi Jinping, that there were already domestic considerations that China had to make with regard to the actions it took, particularly after 2000. Well, first I'll say after Tiananmen, but then also 2008. That again there was a response in terms of what the United States was doing, but there were also domestic drivers. There were party drivers, and that's the one thing that I think American policymakers and presidents forgot. They were, in many ways, again, repeated with regard to the end of the Cold War and moving onwards. What they did during the Vietnam War was they manipulated public opinion. They fed the American public lies. And so there was one sort of response that the US public could make with regard to the Vietnam War, because they were only given a certain amount of information. And the same, I think, applies in terms of this period in which, if you look at particularly the Clinton administration, the manipulation of, okay, we're entering here for humanitarian reasons, but we're entering here because of the threat to national security. But if everything comes from the way that the United States and policymakers are able to basically manipulate public opinion, the American people never had basically the real set of facts. And now this is another, of course, territory that we're entering in terms of the Trump administration, but that definitely took place at the end of the Cold War into the 90s and into the 2000s. With regard to China, I would just say one of the things that deeply troubled Beijing was basically after Tiananmen Square, they saw what the United States did with regard to Eastern Europe. And they saw Russia's response. They saw Putin's response. They saw what happened in terms of what Putin took away with Kosovo under Clinton. And I think one of these, again, we only see it in terms of the US public opinion spectrum and what Clinton was trying to do, but there were ramifications and reverberations in Moscow and Beijing that I don't think our policymakers, our presidents took into account. And that happened with regard to the Vietnam War, again and again, with regard to Hanoi and Saigon.
So I think I want to raise 2 points for kind of 2 quick lightning rounds, because this issue, and Charlie's already raised the globalization. This is a very important question, and I'd like to make it in kind of a specific way. it wasn't just trade liberalization, but the fact that it was carried out without fulfilling the commitments to address needs for worker retraining. There are other related issues of deindustrialization, automation. It was a very complex period where the economy was changing and US policy did not arguably take account of that. And for Charlie, I'm going to come back to you because you write in your terrific book, Isolationism, you have 6 different sources of isolationism. You have said you consider this the most important, I think, but what were the missed opportunities in your view? What should the US have been doing at what juncture for this to have dampened the isolationists, where American workers and Americans generally are most impacted by this far more than the wars that we fought, I would submit?
Yeah, I think it's a combination, Linda, of the external and the internal. That is to say, when things are not going well abroad and where the United States seems to be engaging in policies that aren't working out, you get a popular backlash, as we did with Vietnam and as we seem to be getting now with Iran. But the sensitivity of the American public to what's going on in abroad, I think, is heightened when there is economic insecurity and economic dislocation at home. And in some ways, I think this is the piece of the puzzle that I think many of us did not see coming. You know, I, Steve, and others were worried back in the 90s and in the 2000s about NATO enlargement, about overreach, about attempting to preserve the unipolar moment rather than channel what comes next. But I think very few people saw the kind of the economic, the inside, the domestic piece of this. And I do think it's a combination of forces that are unstoppable and uncontrollable. That is the advance of digital technology, of automation, of social media. AI is going to make this problem worse, coupled with, I think, a kind of hands-off approach to the domestic economy. Because I do think that we could have done things, and you mentioned some of them, Linda, such as worker retraining, such as education, such as getting more broadband internet into those parts of the country that are deindustrialized, place-based domestic investment that would have eased the impact. And then we open the doors to free trade at the same time that automation is picking up. And by some estimates, China's entry into the WTO got rid of 4 million manufacturing jobs in the United States. And so we've gone to from a country in which roughly 40% of the workforce was on the production line to today where about 8% of the workforce is in manufacturing. And I think that is in some ways the kind of canary in the coal mine that we need to figure out if we're going to address what I would call the kind of stumbling of American democracy, the rebuilding of the middle class, and the restoration of a political center.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. I think there's several dimensions to all of this. I mean, let's not forget the 2007, 2008 financial crisis, hugely important, and also another setback for which nobody really was ever held accountable, right? And this played into populist critiques later on. Second, we missed, and Charlie alluded to this, we missed the distributional consequences of globalization. Globalization was terrific for the economy as a whole. It was terrific for people in a variety of places. It was good for Harvard professors. But it wasn't good for the people who were losing their jobs, and the negative consequences for them were far greater than the positive consequences on an individual basis for all of us, and it generated some of the anger. As Ben said earlier before, we began to see that there were some design flaws in the World Trade Organization. It didn't know how to handle the specific nature of Chinese capitalism and the relationship of firms to the state there, and the dispute settlement mechanism continued to not be able to handle that as well. And finally, and this gets back to our earlier discussion, there was a huge opportunity cost involved in this. You know, my colleague Linda Billms likes to estimate that the cost of the forever wars was somewhere around $6 or $7 trillion, right? You could have done an awful lot with that money here at the United States, especially in an era where interest rates were incredibly low. And some people were saying this is a time to do a lot of infrastructure investment here in the United States. It didn't happen for a variety of reasons, and partly because we were spending a lot of money creating really nice air bases in Bagram, Afghanistan, and not necessarily creating as many really nice airports here in the United States.
Pay off all those mortgages.
Yeah, pay off mortgages, leave more money in consumers' pockets.
Do you have a brief comment, Hang, you'd like?
I guess all I would say is that I think the problem with, as we started in 1991 to get to 2016, is the promise of neoliberalism combined with neoconservatism that basically lost. I don't know, I'm going to mangle this, and they'll probably revoke my membership to the Council of Foreign Relations, but that there was something about pushing neoliberalism to our allies across the world, and they did not, there wasn't what they wanted. And I think it was without the support system, was without democracy, and that what it basically happened was basically expand the haves and the haves not within these countries and globally.
Good. Well, I will open up, but I do want to try one more time a real lightning round to just plant the seeds for maybe further discussion. And Steve, I want to start with you because it is clear, I think, to many of us that the restraint community, if I may call it that, has gained traction, and for good reason. People want a better match between policy goals and means. But I think there's, it's important to note that at least some of that community does not reject the need for international cooperation and the need for reliance on diplomacy and the mere fact of the interdependence in dealing with the systemic challenges, whether it's pandemics or climate or other things. So perhaps just a quick note about whether you think that there are disputes perhaps about which form it should take and so forth. I'd note a recent poll shows support for NATO is still very strong, even the support for its Article 5 provisions to repel any invasion of Russia into Europe. So, but just maybe quick thoughts about the utility and the support for such mechanisms.
Yeah, I think so. The way in which the restraint community is often caricatured as a bunch of isolationists, which is completely false. Right, all the restrainers I know believe the United States should be actively engaged economically and diplomatically, and in some cases militarily around the world. Most of the opposition is to the kind of foolish uses of military power that we've done in the past that have not worked out well. So people in that community are just as upset by what's happening today as we were upset by what was happening in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere. Would like to see much greater reliance on diplomacy, which tends to work out much better for the United States overall. And until we shift back from thinking that the way to solve political problems in distant places is to blow things up and focusing more on devising political solutions that might be able to actually address some of these problems in a more lasting way, we're going to find ourselves continuing to do the same sorts of things we've been doing in the past. It is really striking, and I still don't have a completely satisfactory explanation in my own head, but why we seem to be repeating this under very different presidents. I mean, you couldn't ask for a different set of people than Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, and yet all of them in that period found that there were political problems that were best solved by sending a cruise missile, sending a plane, sending something, blowing something up, and then hoping you could talk your way through the problem afterwards. And I think until we get the balance shifted back a bit more towards what are the politics here, what are the political issues at stake, what does the other side want, how much are we permitted to even contemplate letting them have, even if we get 80%, can we allow them to have 20% of what they want, et cetera? The sorts of diplomacy that worked well in the early Cold War, first panel, that worked well in the Bush administration 41, et cetera. We've lost sight of that, it seems to me, and that's part of the lost promise of the unipolar moment.
Could I jump in with my final thoughts? And while I'm a historian, one of the things that I'm doing now is trying to apply my historical research to current policy, and in particular play in this U.S.-Vietnam reconciliation space. And one of the things I always say when I meet with, and I provide them a platform to meet, a channel for them to meet and have basically frank discussions about Vietnam's position regionally, but also globally, and strengthening U.S.-Vietnam relations. And as I always say, our shared histories, U.S.-Vietnam, suffered the most in the 20th century. That it's, that Vietnam, again, was the biggest loser of the post-45 era, having 3 wars and still emerged victorious, but suffered in peace. That the 21st century, the U.S.-Vietnam Comprehensive Strategic Partnership has the ability to actually maintain peace in the Asia-Pacific region. And I always say that, I'm like, we can rectify the wrong of the 20th century in the 21st century. And the Vietnamese always say to their American counterparts, look, while whatever you do, different presidential administrations, don't forget us, don't make us choose sides. We want to continue working with you despite all of this going on with the tariffs, but just hear us out. And I think one of the things that I always keep saying is that we'll keep the communication lines open. And so here's one of the ways that despite whatever happens, just listen to our allies and watch what they do and see how they respond.
Thank you. Charlie, would you like a quick word on what you think is the most important international institution to not throw out with the bathwater?
Yeah, just 2 final comments. One is that I have a less charitable view of the restraint camp than Steve does. I think it's all over the place. I think there are isolationists out there. Many of them are in part of the MAGA movement. And I do think it's something that those of us who are what I would call selective engagers need to be mindful. I think there's a sweet spot between doing too much and doing too little, and we need to find that. Final comment, I'll just pick up on the comment that you made, Linda. One of the things that most worries me is not, war, not war, who do we bomb next? But the erosion of multilateralism, the erosion of cooperation, particularly across ideological and geopolitical dividing lines. Because, the big issues of the day may well be things that can only be tackled through broad initiative, whether it's climate, whether it's nuclear proliferation, whether it's global health. We need to figure out how to work together with countries, even if we don't agree on how they govern themselves. Otherwise, we're all going to sink together.
Well, with that, I want to remind everyone that we're on the record and invite members and guests and those on Zoom, as well as in the room, to come forward with your questions. And we'll start here. Yes, please.
Thank you, Adrian Karatnitsky. Just very briefly, I think the panel would have benefited from a little bit more ideological balance, but I welcome the expertise of the panelists. But I do want to make a couple of observations. First, I do, and invite your comment. It is a myth that impoverishment in the United States and jobs at the lower end have been shrinking. What has happened, as statistics show, is the expansion of the upper middle classes. And I think in the rather uncharitable discussion of the spread of liberal internationalism, we forget the hundreds of millions of people who've ended up in freedom, and also the periodization of this panel, which basically excludes the Reagan era from the beginning of the march towards liberal democracy, its promotion and expansion. Therefore, also excludes, what happened in Argentina, what happened in Chile. Okay, these are not perfect societies, but they're societies where freedom was expanded. Central Asia, the progress our allies made in places like Korea. So it seems to me that we need to have a little bit of an element of balance between, it wasn't all about intervention, military intervention. It wasn't all about arrogance. I think there was a kind of a humanitarian impulse, and I think American people support it. And MAGA, by the way, 90% of people in MAGA, according to the latest polls, support the attack on Iraq.
Thank you. I think your points are very well taken, and democracies have grown and benefited in various regions, as you point out. Miriam, please.
Oh, excuse me. Miriam Safi, CFR Life Member, and I've been a Foreign Service officer for close to 20 years. My question is for Professor Walt. I started my career under Obama, and I've seen in your foreign affairs piece, you talk about the United States as a predatory hegemon and this cycle of sort of the military expansionism. How do we break free of the cycle? a day after a future administration, especially kind of grounded in the realism and the restraint of the George H.W. Bush era, and going back to sort of expertise and a foreign policy that's sort of grounded in humility.
There's a so let me try and take a swing at both of those together. Many of your points are valid. One of the things you could also give credit for this period we were asked to speak about, the sort of post-Cold War period, was that, you know, at least 1 billion people around the world were lifted out of the lowest levels of poverty. So globalization had real benefits for some parts, and that's not a bad thing, right, in and of itself. On the spread of freedom, that's much less clear in this period. The first 10 years look pretty good. Eastern Europe looks like it's moving democratic. Some countries in Latin America. According to both Freedom House and the Economist Democracy Index, democracy has been in retreat for 20 years now. Number of people living in a free society and number of countries that are truly free, et cetera, has declined steadily since the early to mid-aughts, and that's something that ought to disturb us. Also, and I stand corrected if you know more about this, but my feeling of how the United States handled South Korea, which was a military dictatorship for decades, and yet a close American ally, is about right. Right? We did not try to impose democracy upon them. We nudged in the gentlest possible way. We let South Korea decide it wanted to become a democracy of its own sort, and one could make the argument that South Korean democracy is looking a little healthier than our own right now. So you might reflect about that. In terms of predatory hegemony, I mean, you're going to have a different administration because this is an administration that wants to act like a predatory hegemon. And by that, I mean a country that is trying to take advantage and reap unequal benefits from everyone. All great powers are predatory towards their adversaries. They want to get the better of a deal. They want to look for advantage all the time. A predatory hegemon does that with your allies too. Turns to the most pro-American countries in the world like Canada and Denmark and tries to take something from them or take advantage of them in a variety of ways. And I don't think this administration is likely to change that policy. You're going to have a different administration to do that.
Would you like, or Charlie, would you like to speak on the perhaps under-emphasized benefits of globalization and democratization?
I would just say that, I agree with Adrian writ large that over the course of its history, the United States has made the world a better place and has succeeded in replicating the American experiment in many parts of the world that had no history, no experience with liberalism or with democracy. But that doesn't mean that we didn't overdo it, particularly in the period that we're talking about. And as we're trying to figure out how we ended up where we are today, I think we need to speak soberly about what we got right and what we got wrong. And I also think, Adrian, that I just have a very different read on what's happened to the American middle class. Yes, inequality has gone through the roof. Yes, globalization and automation has advantaged some. But, I grew up in Wisconsin. Most parts of Wisconsin outside of the big cities right now are dead. And that's simply because they have been deindustrialized. And a lot of the rest of the country has been deindustrialized. And those workers are hurting.
So I'd like to take one more question in the room, and then if we have any on Zoom, please, in the middle here.
Thanks. I'm Robin Meredith. I'm with Morgan Stanley and author of The Elephant and the Dragon, which is about India and China. We've been talking about the politics and the history of the lost promise of the post-Cold War era. But one of the things I wanted to go back to was, one of the big promises of a peace dividend was rising incomes, hopefully around the world, a rejuvenation of the U.S. economy. Of course, it hasn't quite worked out that way, or hasn't worked out evenly for all sectors of the economy. As you point out, lower segments, manufacturing workers, et cetera, have come out as losers. The rich have gotten much, much richer, et cetera. What are some of the solutions, is my question, We've talked a lot about what we shouldn't do militarily. What should we be doing to help workers at all levels, particularly those who've been the big losers, that we're not doing?
I'd like to take that on. We don't have an economist
Yeah.
on our panel, so I want to.
I'm going to stay
Not
in my
push
lane
anyone.
and say if I start prescribing economic policy for the country, things could get even worse.
I'm more or less in the same boat as Steve, except I will say this much. I think the course that we're headed down is the wrong course. And that the idea that somehow we're going to put tariffs on everything that's coming in from abroad and Americans are going to get their jobs back on the production line, this ain't going to happen. And in fact, it's going to make things worse because those workers are not only not getting their jobs back on a production line, but they're paying 20%, 30% more for what they buy, and now 50% more for gasoline. And so in some ways, I think the $60 million question is, what is the future of work in the digital age? What can we do now to educate Americans, both young Americans, but also those Americans that have been on the losing end of globalization and audit? What can we do to educate them for the jobs that are going to be out there? I don't know the answer to that question, but I think the person who does know the answer will be richer than Elon Musk.
I'll just jump in. I had a very interesting conversation with a CFR member who was presenting in front of countries in Southeast Asia, not Singapore, and he was pushing superannuation, so sovereign wealth fund, a pre-distribution of wealth as one route that these frontier markets could take and how the state could play a positive role.
Thank you. And if we don't have anyone on Zoom? Yes, we do. Good.
We'll take the next question from Jeffrey Price.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thanks. I'd like to just pose a couple points in defense of the foreign policy of the 1990s. First, it doesn't seem to me that it's fair to lump the liberal internationalism of the 90s with the neoconservatism of the 2000s. For one, there was a concerted campaign in 1998 for forcible regime change in Iraq. The Clinton administration considered that. The analysis was, among other things, that it might cause civil war, instability, it would be hard to get out, change the regional balance, and the biggest beneficiary would be Iran. So I think very different from the policy of the 2000s. But more current point, NATO's open door. It seems to me that, well, I guess the question for Steve and Charlie, it seems to me that the world is a safer place because Poland and the Balts are in NATO. But I would invite, your analysis on that point.
I think in some respects, Bill Clinton was an extraordinarily lucky president in many ways, one of which was that the negative consequences of some of his decisions didn't come down the pike until after he was president. Right? And I would point to two. I believe NATO enlargement was a mistake, and the Partnership for Peace was a smarter approach, the approach that the Defense Department, for example, initially favored. Why? Because it did a lot of the things that enlarging NATO would have done, but it also was open to Russia. Russia was actively considered, a potential member of that, and I think that could have led to a much more ultimately stable European situation than the one we had. The second one, which we haven't mentioned at all, was the policy of dual containment, which was adopted in the early 1990s, where the United States says we are going to simultaneously contain Iraq and Iran, even though, of course, they're rivals with each other. We're going to contain both of them, and that required the United States to keep a lot of military forces in Saudi Arabia, which is one of the reasons that Osama bin Laden gave for why he wanted to attack the United States of America. So if you want to play counterfactual history, imagine no dual containment in the 1990s, a policy, by the way, was opposed by people like Zbigniew Brzezinski and Brent Scowcroft. No dual containment, which means no 9/11 attack, which means no global war on terror, which means probably no war in Iraq, et cetera, et cetera. So dual containment is, to me, was a strategic mistake that ultimately had negative consequences, but after Clinton left office.
Yeah, I would add that, I broadly agree with you, Jeff, that that we're probably being a bit too hard on the Clinton administration. I think they got a lot right. And I also think that our narrative of that period is being heavily colored by what happened after 9/11. And had it not been for the invasion of Iraq, had it not been for the ever wars, our reading of the 1990s would, I think, be quite different. So I think it's important to make that point. On NATO enlargement, just a couple points. Number one is that, had it been stopped with Poland and the Balts, or maybe a few more, I would have less heartache about it. But the fact that it has gone through 7 waves of enlargement, that NATO in 2008 said they're going to bring in Georgia and Ukraine, this just strikes me as asking for trouble, right? Any country would not like it when the largest, most impressive military alliance in history gets closer and closer to your borders. And I'll just offer one anecdote that reflects the conversations that I had. I was in the Clinton administration at the time, fighting not for NATO enlargement, but for the Partnership for Peace, as Steve said. And one conversation I had that's always stuck with me was I was arguing with one of the principals that was driving forward the policy. And he said to me, "Charlie, I'd rather leave geopolitics out of it." And that sort of has led me to believe that there really was a kind of moralistic, ideological view about righting the wrongs of Malta, doing the right thing in a way that I think lacked realist sobriety. And I think that lack of realist sobriety came back to haunt us.
Thank you. So we have time for a couple of more questions. Let's take this woman here.
Thank you very much. Mojuba Olufunke Okome, professor of political science at Brooklyn College. The celebration of this virtuous relationship between democracy and development and globalization being good for all of us. It wasn't good for Africa. It's still not good. And I think if America was more aware of the criticisms from Africans, from global South countries that were not benefiting from the hyping of democracy and globalization being put together, the country would be better off now. So I'm always very puzzled about why what's happening in the rest of the world matters not even in a tiny way to the obsessive concerns about what this country is doing and why it's the best thing for the world and how come those people are not making it happen or they're mistaken. The problem with the Olive Tree book is its real, obtuse focus on the presumed success of globalization and blindness to the havoc that was being wreaked in the lives of many people. If there's any gains, it was mostly in India and China, where a huge middle class emerged. And that was also at a cost. So why is this not important? And we're just talking about policy and the US and, hegemony.
Thank you. I think perhaps both of you have a word about this. I know you've written, Stephen, about the public opinion of others.
If we have time for one more question, we should take them both and then just
find this gentleman.
Khalil Bird, KB, life member, Kennedy School grad. What did we lose out on because we didn't see an H.W. Bush second term? You started talking about it a little bit, but I want to hear what would he have done in those 4 or 5 years?
All right. So I'm very sympathetic to the first question of that the United States has routinely, going back long before the period we were talking about, neglected much of what was going on in the global South. We were East-West focused during the Cold War. We became sort of, transatlantic obsessed. We've gotten more interested in Asia and India, some other places, but Africa has always been trailing behind, arguably even behind Latin America, which we also tend to neglect. I think one can make a case that some aspects of globalization did, in fact, improve economic conditions in some parts of Africa, countries that have been able to attract foreign investment and do good things with it. But I am not an expert on Africa, and I know enough to know that that record is certainly an uneven one. I have no idea what Bush would have done in a second term. I suspect he would have had a different team eventually over time because teams tend to recycle. And if you read John Meacham's biography of the elder Bush, it does make it sound like he was tired. He was out of gas by the end of his one term as president and didn't run the greatest campaign, et cetera. And so I worry that, in fact, a second term would not have been all that wonderful in various ways. Again, I think he and his team had done a remarkable job dealing with a very turbulent, very different international environment, but I'm not sure they had a lot more left to do. Maybe in the Middle East, but I'm not even sure about that.
I could quickly add that Jim Baker was very involved, though, in the Iraq study group in trying to find an alternative to the surge in Iraq. So I think that's a good question. Let's just wind up with final comments from Charlie, and then we'll end with Hung.
Yeah, my only comment would be that I do think that things are changing when it comes to the developing world or the global South, whatever the appropriate terminology is. And one of the features of the kind of global landscape that I find most striking about the last few years is how many countries out there are not taking sides. They're not with us. They're not with Russia and China. India is in some ways the gold standard here. Modi practicing what he calls multi-alignment. He comes here for a state dinner, then he flies off to Moscow and he hugs Putin, and then he's in Beijing with Xi Jinping. And I think there is a degree to which countries like India, Nigeria, South Africa, UAE, Turkey, they're playing the field now in ways that I think we really haven't seen in the modern era. And I think it's partly because they have options, because all roads don't lead to Washington anymore. And I think that in some respects is a good, positive development, and it will mean that countries that have more agency will be able, in the end of the day, to pursue policies that do them better.
I'll be very quick, and I echo your sentiments. And the only kind of optimistic outlook I can have that if we are in a 21st century Cold War is I think China's Belt and Road Initiative and reaching out to countries in the global South, not winning the countries in these regions over. So that's again, outside of America's control, but that's something that we have to our advantage, that I don't see there being a choosing of sides, particularly and including Africa, but also the countries of Southeast Asia that would choose to go and resemble the PRC. The only thing I'll say, we never play with counterfactuals in history because we're terrible at them, unlike political scientists. But I would have loved to see a second term for George H.W. Bush, because at least he was, and again, it wasn't that Clinton didn't know foreign policy, but it was much more a domestic politics person. And as a diplomatic historian and wanting a grand strategist, I think that a second term would have been great if George H.W. Bush had been reelected. So it's more an answer to that there wasn't a coherent strategy under Clinton. And plus, because personalities matter and because he had his hands full with what he was doing and Monica Lewinsky, we wouldn't have had that. So I would think it would have been better.
So our next session will actually deal with the future and the Trump era. So after the break, you'll begin back here at 3:15. Thank you so very much. Thank you.
That was great. All right, Charlie.
Bye-bye. Nice to see everybody.